Why do so many people reach the later chapters of life and wonder where the years have gone? Why do so many bright, capable, decent human beings live far below their potential, not because they lack talent, not because they lack opportunity, but because they have never truly decided where they are going? This is one of the great tragedies of human life. Most people do not collapse in failure. They do not explode in defeat. They simply drift, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. They wake up, go through familiar routines, react to the demands of the day, and call it living. But reacting is not living. Existing is not the same as building a life. A drifting person is like a ship without a destination. The engines may be running. The vessel may be seaworthy. The sea may even be calm. But without a charted course, that ship will go wherever the winds and currents decide. And that, in essence, is what happens to millions of people. They allow the currents of public opinion, temporary emotion, fear, distraction, and habit to determine the direction of their lives. They confuse movement with progress. They mistake busyness for purpose. And in doing so, they surrender the one gift that makes human life extraordinary: the ability to choose a destination and move toward it deliberately. The truth is, drifting rarely looks dangerous in the beginning. It looks comfortable. It looks reasonable. It whispers, "You can think about your future tomorrow. You can get serious next week. You can define your purpose someday. You can define your purpose someday." But someday is the favorite language of drift. Someday is where ambition goes to die. Someday is where dreams are postponed until they become regrets. And while a person is waiting for the perfect moment, life is moving. Days become months. Months become years. And one morning they find themselves standing in the results of thoughts they never examined and habits they never challenged. But here is the encouraging news. The very moment a person becomes aware that they have been drifting, they are no longer powerless. Awareness is the beginning of change. The instant you recognize that your life has been guided more by accident than by intention, you have taken the first great step toward freedom. Because now you can decide, you can choose to stop surrendering your future to uncertainty. You can choose to stop living by default. You can choose today to live by design. Everything begins with a simple but life-changing question. What do I want? Not what does the world expect of me? Not what has been handed to me by habit or fear, but what do I truly want to become, to build, to contribute, to experience? When a person answers that honestly, something remarkable happens. The fog begins to lift. The mind, once scattered, starts to gather strength. Energy that was leaking into confusion begins to move in a single direction. And life, which once felt random, begins to take shape around purpose. No one has to remain a prisoner of drift. No one is condemned to wander through life half awake, pulled by circumstances. A person can change direction in a single decision, and that decision can be made now. Not when conditions improve. Not when fear disappears. Not when every answer is known. Now, the day you decide your destination is the day your life begins to change, because purpose gives power to effort. Direction gives meaning to discipline, and a clearly chosen aim turns even small daily steps into the architecture of a remarkable life. So if you have been drifting, let today be the day it ends. Let today be the day you take hold of your mind, define your course, and refuse to hand over another year to uncertainty. Your future is not something that merely happens to you. It is something you can shape. And the first step is not complicated. It is simply this: stop drifting, choose your destination, and begin. Most people never arrive at a place they truly chose because they never stop long enough to choose it. That is the quiet danger. Failure, at least, announces itself. Failure gets our attention. It forces a man or woman to pause, to reconsider, to ask what went wrong and what must now be done differently. But drifting is far more subtle. It makes no loud noise. It sends no urgent warning. It does not appear in dramatic headlines. It simply carries a person along, one ordinary day at a time, until years have passed, and the life they meant to build remains untouched. That is why so many people do not fail in any obvious way. They simply move without direction, work without purpose, and live without a clearly defined aim. A drifting life can look respectable from the outside. A person may rise in the morning, go to work, pay bills, speak politely, and fulfill expected duties. They may appear responsible, even successful by certain social standards. Yet inwardly, something is missing. There is no central target, no definite purpose, no chosen destination that gathers all thought, effort, and energy into one meaningful path. And without that aim, even sincere effort becomes scattered. Hours are spent, strength is used, opportunities come and go, but nothing is built with intention. Life becomes a series of reactions instead of creations. The great tragedy is that drifting often begins in innocence. Few people set out to waste their lives. Few decide in youth that they will hand over their future to chance. It happens gradually. A young person grows up, hearing many voices, but rarely hears the one voice that matters most. The quiet inner call asking, "What is your purpose? What are you moving toward?" So they do what others do. They follow the crowd. They accept the common script. They choose what seems safe, what seems popular, what seems expected. They postpone serious thought. They assume clarity will come later, as though direction were something life gives automatically with age. But direction does not arrive on its own. It is chosen, and if it is never chosen, then life defaults to drift. There is an enormous difference between motion and progress. Motion is activity. Progress is activity, aimed at a result. A person may be busy every waking hour and still be drifting. They may answer calls, attend meetings, perform tasks, chase deadlines, and fill calendars, yet remain no closer to the life they truly want. Busyness can become one of the most effective disguises for aimlessness. It gives the comforting illusion that because one is occupied, one must also be advancing. But a man on a treadmill may sweat and strain and still remain in the same place. So it is with the human being who has never fixed a clear destination in the mind. When a person has no definite aim, outside forces take control. Circumstances begin to dictate direction. The opinions of others carry too much weight. Temporary emotions begin making permanent choices. Fear becomes a navigator. Convenience becomes a philosophy. Habit becomes destiny. Instead of asking, "What do I want my life to stand for?" the drifting person asks, "What is easiest? What will avoid criticism? What are others doing?" And because these questions can never lead to a deeply satisfying life, the result is often quiet frustration. Not always dramatic misery, but a dull sense of emptiness. A feeling that one is made for more, yet cannot quite grasp what that more is, because it has never been clearly named. This is why drifting is so dangerous. It feels normal. It blends into everyday life so completely that millions accept it as the natural condition of adulthood. They believe uncertainty is maturity, resignation is wisdom, and routine is all life has to offer. But human beings were not meant merely to endure time. They were meant to direct it, shape it, invest it, and use it in service of something meaningful. A person with a purpose walks differently through the world. There is a distinct quality to their actions. Even their small efforts are connected to something larger. They know why they rise in the morning. They know what they are trying to become. And because they know, their days begin to take on weight and direction. By contrast, the drifter lives at the mercy of passing moods and passing trends. One day they feel inspired and declare a new beginning. The next day discomfort appears, and they abandon the idea. They are like leaves in the wind, moved by every gust, because they have no roots in a chosen aim, and life does not reward that condition. The world tends to make way for the person who knows where he is going, but it has little use for the person who wanders without intent, not because the wandering person lacks value, but because direction is the instrument through which value becomes visible. There is also a deep psychological cost to drifting. The mind longs for coherence. It wants to know that effort matters, that sacrifice has meaning, that today connects to tomorrow. When those connections are absent, discouragement begins to grow. A person may not even understand the source of it. They may blame their job, their age, their environment, or their luck. Their age, their environment, or their luck. But often the deeper issue is that the soul is starved of purpose. It is difficult to feel fully alive when one is not moving toward anything clearly worth reaching. And yet the moment this truth is recognized, the entire pattern can begin to change. The realization that one has been drifting is not a verdict of failure. It is the awakening of possibility. It is proof that the mind has begun to rise above unconscious habit. Because once a person sees the drift, They can no longer pretend it is direction. Once they become aware that they have been moving without aim, they gain the power to choose differently. That is where transformation begins, not in perfect conditions, not in special talent, but in honest recognition. Most people do not fail in a blaze of defeat. They simply drift, and the years collect around them like dust on unused furniture. Their talents remain underdeveloped, their hopes remain postponed, and their lives become the sum total of unchosen routines. But the human story does not have to continue that way. The mind can be trained, a purpose can be chosen, a destination can be named, and from that moment onward, every day, every action, every discipline, and every thought can begin to move in a deliberate direction. So that instead of being carried by life, a person begins at last to carry life toward a meaning of their own. A person without a definite purpose rarely remains truly independent for long, because where there is no chosen direction, something else will always rush in to take control. Human life does not remain still. The mind is always moving towards something, whether consciously or unconsciously. If a man or woman does not decide what they want, what they stand for, and where they intend to go, then circumstances, fear, routine, and the expectations of other people begin making those decisions for them. That is the silent cost of living without purpose. It is not merely that progress slows down. It is that control slows down. It is that control slowly slips away. Purpose is more than a goal written on paper. It is an organizing force. It gives shape to thought, meaning to effort, and direction to daily living. It acts like a compass in the mind. Without it, even intelligent people can spend years moving from one demand to another without ever asking whether those demands deserve their life. They respond instead of create. They adjust instead of build. They survive instead of lead. And because they never establish an inner standard for what matters most, they become highly vulnerable to whatever presses most urgently upon them in the moment. Circumstances are powerful, but they were never meant to be masters. They are conditions to be dealt with, not authorities to be obeyed. Yet the person without purpose often treats present conditions as permanent truth. If money is tight, they assume their future must remain small. If opportunities appear limited, they conclude that limitation is destiny. If the people around them think narrowly, they begin to think narrowly as well. In other words, they allow outer conditions to determine inner possibilities. This is what happens when purpose is absent. Instead of using the mind to rise above circumstances, they let circumstances define the mind. A person with a definite purpose may face the same difficulties, but interprets them differently. They see hardship as a challenge to be managed, not a sentence to be accepted. They are not immune to obstacles, but they are less likely to be ruled by them because they possess something stronger than the obstacle, a chosen direction. When a person knows where they are going, temporary storms lose some of their power. They may still delay progress, but they do not permanently alter the course. The purposeless person, however, is often turned aside by the first storm wind, because there is no deep internal commitment holding them steady. Fear becomes especially dangerous in the absence of purpose. Fear is not always loud. Often it appears as hesitation, self-doubt, overthinking, or endless postponement. A person says they are waiting for better timing, more confidence, more knowledge, more certainty. But behind many of these delays is fear wearing a polite disguise. Fear asks, what if I fail? What if people criticize me? What if I choose wrongly? What if I am not good enough? These questions can paralyze the purposeless person because they have no larger aim strong enough to overcome them. When nothing meaningful has been chosen, discomfort easily becomes a stopping point. Purpose does not eliminate fear, but it changes the relationship to it. A person with a clear aim may still feel uncertainty, but they are more willing to move through it because the purpose matters more than the discomfort. The mind begins to say, yes, this is difficult, but it is necessary. Yes, I am afraid, but the goal is worth the risk. Fear loses some of its command when it is forced to compete with conviction, but where conviction is missing, fear sits on the throne. It begins making choices, setting limits, and defining what seems possible. Habit is another ruler that takes over when purpose is absent. Human beings are creatures of repetition. What we do repeatedly shapes what we become. This can be a magnificent force when guided by intention, but a destructive one when allowed to operate blindly. The purposeless person often falls into routines not because they are meaningful, but because they are familiar. They repeat thoughts they did not choose, actions they never examined, and patterns that offer comfort without growth. Days become predictable, then months, then years. Life turns into a cycle of automatic behavior. There is movement, but no fresh vision behind it. This is why habit can quietly become destiny. A person may tell themselves they are free, yet wake at the same time, think the same thoughts, make the same excuses, tolerate the same dissatisfaction, and postpone the same decisions year after year. Without purpose, routine hardens into identity. A person begins to believe they simply are the way they have been living. They stop imagining a different future, because habit has narrowed the boundaries of possibility. And once the imagination shrinks, life tends to shrink with it. The influence of other people also becomes stronger when purpose is weak. Human beings naturally seek acceptance, and there is nothing wrong with that in itself. But the person who has not chosen a meaningful direction often becomes overly dependent on approval. They hesitate to act unless others agree. They shrink back from ambition if it seems unusual. They adjust their dreams downward to fit the comfort level of their surroundings. Instead of asking whether something is true, worthy, or deeply important, they ask whether it will be accepted. In this way, public opinion becomes a substitute for inner guidance. This is one of the saddest forms of surrender, because it looks so reasonable on the surface. A person says they are simply being practical, realistic, or careful, but many lives have been diminished by living too carefully according to the limitations of others. People who are uncertain of their own purpose often borrow their identity from the crowd. They follow the emotional climate of the day. They adopt the beliefs of their environment. They become echoes rather than voices. And all the while, the deeper self remains unexplored. A definite purpose changes all of this, because it creates an internal center. It gives a person a point from which to judge circumstances, resist fear, break habit, and withstand the pressure of conformity. It does not mean they become rigid or arrogant. It means they become directed. Their life is no longer an open field for every passing influence. They begin to evaluate choices in light of a larger aim. They ask, does this move me closer to the life I intend to build, or farther away from it? That single question can restore enormous personal power. The tragedy is not that people face fear, difficult conditions, or social pressure. Everyone faces those things. The tragedy is that so many face them without a clear purpose, and therefore without a stable inner structure strong enough to resist them. In that condition, life becomes reactive. One lives according to weather instead of stars. One makes choices by pressure instead of principle. One drifts into a future designed by accident rather than intention. But the moment a person chooses a definite purpose, the balance begins to shift. Circumstances may still exist, but they are no longer the author of the story. Fear may still speak, but it is no longer the final authority. Habit may still pull backward, but it no longer defines the future. The opinions of others may still be heard, but they no longer decide the course. All of that changes when a man or woman selects a worthy aim and commits to it with seriousness, because purpose is the foundation upon which self-direction, courage, and meaningful living are built. Drifting never announces itself as a thief. It does not break into a person's life with noise or violence. It comes quietly dressed in comfort, routine, and postponement. That is why so many people underestimate it. They imagine that danger must out-danger must L. Oh, dramatic. That wasted years must come from some great visible failure, some public collapse, some devastating mistake. But often, the greatest losses in life do not come from catastrophe. They come from slow surrender. They come from living without intention for so long that a person no longer notices what is being taken, and what is being taken is far more valuable than money or status. It is time, it is energy, it is possibility. It is the unbuilt version of a life that could have been remarkable. At first, drifting feels harmless because it asks for so little. It does not demand a person to abandon all ambition in one day. It merely suggests delay. It says, there is no need to decide now, no urgency to think deeply, No reason to define a goal today when tomorrow seems so available. It persuades people to remain casual about the most important things. It teaches them to treat purpose as optional and discipline as something they can adopt later. Because there is no immediate pain in this, the pattern continues. A person still eats, works, socializes, rests, and moves through ordinary routines, so life appears to be functioning. On the surface, nothing seems terribly wrong, yet beneath that surface something essential is slipping away. The first thing drifting steals is time, and it steals it in the smallest denominations. A single wasted hour seems insignificant. A day spent without direction seems recoverable. A month lived in confusion feels temporary, but life is built from hours, days, and months. What is ignored in small amounts becomes devastating in large amounts. The years do not vanish all at once. They disappear one unplanned day at a time, one delay. One excuse, one period of waiting for motivation, one season of "I'll get serious later." By the time a person recognizes the pattern, a decade may have passed, and what makes this especially painful is that the loss often cannot be measured only by calendar years. It must also be measured by what those years might have become if they had been invested with aim and conviction. A person may arrive at middle age or later years and suddenly feel a strange ache that is difficult to describe. Outwardly, they may have done what was expected. They may have stayed busy, fulfilled obligations, and kept moving, yet they feel something unsettled within them. It is not always because they worked too hard or lacked opportunity. Sometimes it is because they spent too many years moving without deliberate direction. They existed, but did not truly build. They responded, but did not consciously create. And now, looking backward, they cannot help but wonder what might have happened if they had chosen a clear destination earlier and pursued it with purpose. Drifting also steals energy. A life without direction is exhausting in a very particular way. The exhaustion does not always come from too much work. Often it comes from misdirected effort. There is a great difference between being tired from meaningful progress and being drained by scattered living. When a person has no defined aim, mental and emotional energy leaks into countless unimportant places. Attention is pulled in every direction. Decisions become harder because there is no guiding principle behind them. Minor distractions gain power because nothing important has been chosen strongly enough to resist them. The mind becomes crowded with unfinished thoughts, vague desires, and untested wishes. This creates a state of inner friction, and friction consumes strength. By contrast, purpose has a concentrating effect. It gathers the mind. It simplifies decisions. It reduces waste. But drifting does the opposite. It fragments attention and weakens momentum. A person may feel chronically tired, not because they are incapable, but their powers are being spent without coordination. They are like a river, broken into shallow streams, never deep enough in one place to generate force. Over time, this weakens confidence. The person begins to assume the problem is in their nature, when in fact the problem may be in the absence of a chosen direction worthy of their full energy. Then there is the theft of unrealized potential, which may be the greatest loss of all. Every person carries within them capacities that cannot be developed accidentally. Character, skill, leadership, wisdom, creative ability, service, courage, and mastery all require intentional cultivation. They do not emerge simply because time passes. They emerge because purpose calls them forth. When a person drifts, these inner resources often remain dormant, not destroyed, but unused. And there are few sorrows deeper than realizing one has lived beneath one's possibilities for too long. Potential is a beautiful word, but it can become a painful one if left unexplored. Society often praises potential in the young, yet potential alone accomplishes nothing. It is only raw material. It must be shaped by direction, tested by discipline, and strengthened by repeated action. The drifting person may remain full of promise for years, but promise without commitment slowly turns into regret. Dreams that are never acted upon do not stay fresh forever. Eventually, they begin to harden into reminders of what was postponed. A person may still speak about what they once hoped to do, but the tone changes. What was once possibility becomes memory. What was once vision becomes a private wound. The cruel irony is that drifting often feels easier in the short term precisely because it avoids the discomfort required for growth. It allows a person to remain in familiar territory. It excuses them from the risk of choosing, the effort of discipline, and the vulnerability of commitment. But that ease is deceptive. What feels easy now often becomes painful later. The avoided effort returns as emptiness. The postponed decision returns as confusion. The missed opportunity returns as regret. Drift sells comfort at the price of a life half-lived, and still, because the process is gradual, many do not see the damage until much later. They look around and wonder why they are restless, why their work feels empty, why their days seem repetitive, why their enthusiasm has faded. Often the answer is not that they are incapable of fulfillment. It is that they have lived too long without demanding a clear reason from themselves for the way they spend their life. They have accepted movement in place of meaning. They have mistaken routine for security and have not noticed the years slipping by underneath. But the recognition of this loss can become a turning point rather than a final judgment. The fact that drifting steals years, energy, and unrealized potential does not mean all is lost. It means the cost of continuing is too high. The moment a person truly sees what drift has taken, they are placed in a position of extraordinary power, because awareness turns vague dissatisfaction into usable truth. It forces an honest reckoning. It asks, how much more will you surrender? How much longer will you hand your future to habit, delay, and uncertainty? Such questions can awaken a person more effectively than comfort ever could. There is still immense hope in this, because life begins to change the moment intention replaces drift. Time regains value when it is linked to purpose. Energy returns when it is concentrated. Potential begins to open when it is summoned by clear direction and faithful action. But none of this happens while a person continues to treat drift as harmless. It must first be seen for what it is. A silent thief that raw, BS not only the calendar, but the very shape and richness of a human life, leaving behind the unbearable thought that one might have become far more if only one had begun sooner. The mind is never still in any meaningful sense. Even in silence, even in ordinary routine, even when a person appears to be doing very little, the mind is moving. It is absorbing impressions, repeating ideas, rehearsing fears, nourishing desires, and forming expectations, nourishing desires, and forming expectations. And over time, the direction of a person's life begins to follow the direction of those repeated thoughts. This is one of the most important truths a human being can ever understand. We become, in large measure, what we think about most often, not instantly, not magically, and not without action, but inevitably through the shaping power of attention. The mind moves in the direction of the thoughts it entertains with consistency, and life soon begins to reflect that inward movement. Every repeated thought is like a small instruction given to the subconscious mind. A single passing thought may have little power, but a thought returned to again and again begins to carve a path. The human mind learns through repetition. It accepts what is repeated as important. It begins to organize feeling, perception, and behavior around the ideas most frequently held. This is why a person who constantly thinks of limitation begins to live cautiously. A person who repeatedly thinks of rejection begins to hesitate. A person who dwells on resentment begins to carry bitterness into every room. The outer life may look varied, but the inner pattern remains the same, and that inner pattern quietly shapes the choices that produce the outer result. Most people underestimate the force of their own habitual thinking because thoughts seem invisible. They do not appear as concrete as money, work, or circumstance. Yet thoughts are the seed form of khandha. Before a person acts, they have already thought. Before a habit becomes visible, it has been rehearsed inwardly. Before a destiny appears in public, it has often been constructed privately in the hidden workshop of the mind. This is why repeated thought matters so profoundly. It is not merely mental noise. It is a blueprint in progress. Consider the person who continually tells himself that he is unlucky, overlooked, or incapable. He may not realize it, but each repetition strengthens a particular identity. The mind begins to search for evidence to support what it has been told. Opportunities are missed because they are not recognized as possible. Courage weakens because the imagination has already been trained to expect defeat. Initiative dies because effort seems useless, when failure has been mentally rehearsed in advance. Soon the person's life begins to reflect the very pattern he has been repeating. Then he points to the outcome as proof that his thinking was correct, never seeing that his thinking helped create the result in the first place. The same principle works in the opposite direction. A person who repeatedly holds thoughts of growth, contribution, discipline, and possibility begins to orient the mind differently. Such a person is not pretending life is easy. They are not denying hardship or ignoring facts. They are choosing the direction in which their mental energies will travel. They decide that their dominant thoughts will support action rather than paralysis, creation rather than paralysis, creation rather than complaint, vision rather than surrender. Over time, these repeated thoughts influence posture, language, decision-making, emotional endurance, and the willingness to persist when progress is slow. In this way, a better future begins not first in the hands, but in the mind. This does not mean that every fleeting positive idea transforms a life. The power lies in repeti. Just the mind follows what it hears most consistently from itself. If noble ideas are entertained, only occasionally, while fear and self-doubt are rehearsed every day, then fear and self-doubt remain the stronger current. The repeated thought becomes the dominant thought, and the dominant thought becomes a governing influence. That is why mental discipline is so essential. It is not enough to admire better ideas. One must return to them until they begin to occupy the center of consciousness. Many people live in a mental environment they did not consciously choose. They absorb the anxieties of the crowd, the limitations of family history, the cynicism of public conversation, and the discouragement of past disappointments. Then they wonder why they feel heavy, hesitant, or directionless. The answer often lies in the content of repeated thinking. A mind fed on worry begins to anticipate trouble. A mind fed on envy begins to be deprived. A mind fed on envy begins to feel deprived. A mind fed on distraction becomes restless and weak. Whatever the mind is repeatedly given, it begins to reflect. It cannot help moving in that direction, because repetition builds familiarity, and familiarity becomes belief. Belief is one of the most powerful forces in human life, and belief is often the child of repeated thought. When a thought is held long enough, especially with emotion attached to it, it ceases to feel like an opinion and starts to feel like reality. A person no longer says, "I have been thinking this." They begin to say, "This is just the way things are." That is the moment when thought has moved beneath the surface and begun to shape identity. From there, action follows almost automatically. The person acts in harmony with what they have come to believe about themselves, about others, and about what is possible. This is why guarding the mind is not a luxury. It is a necessity. One cannot afford to be careless. With repeated thought, to dwell continuously on failure, inadequacy, anger, or hopelessness is to train the mind toward those conditions. To repeatedly meditate on purpose, service, discipline, courage, and meaningful achievement is to train the mind toward a different kind of life. The mind does not remain neutral under repetition. It adapts. It organizes. It inclines itself toward the material most often supplied to it. There is also a moral dimension to this truth. A person becomes responsible, in part, for the atmosphere of their own mind. This does not mean they control every thought that enters. Thoughts can arise from memory, pain, fear, and the influence of the world, but a person does have growing control over which thoughts are welcomed, repeated, and given authority. That choice matters enormously. One thought entertained repeatedly becomes a mood. A mood repeated becomes a disposition. A disposition practiced becomes character, and character over time shapes destiny. When people say they want a different life, they often focus first on changing visible conditions. They want more money, better work, stronger relationships, improved health, deeper confidence. These are worthy desires, but the deeper question is this: what direction is the mind already moving in? If the mind continues to repeat defeat, delay, confusion, and self-neglect, then even favorable circumstances may be wasted. But if the mind begins moving steadily toward clarity, self-respect, discipline, and purpose, then even modest beginnings can become the foundation of remarkable transformation. The law is simple, though not always easy. The mind leans toward whatever it repeats. It becomes shaped by what it dwells upon. It does not drift toward excellence by accident. It must be directed there through chosen thought. To think repeatedly about a worthy goal is to pull the mind in that dire section to think repeatedly about becoming useful, capable, and disciplined is to lay the mental groundwork for such a life. To think repeatedly in terms of fear, weakness, and resignation is to surrender the mind to those forces. A person may not be able to change everything at once, but they can begin changing the current of their thought, and once that current changes, many other things begin to follow. Attention becomes more selective. Action becomes more intentional. Habits begin to align with the ideas held most deeply. Little by little, the life begins to move where the mind has already been traveling, because whether for harm or for growth, whether toward drift or toward purpose, the human being is constantly being led by the thoughts most faithfully repeated. Clear goals have a remarkable effect on ordinary life because they turn scattered effort into directed progress. Without them, days can feel repetitive, uncertain, and strangely empty, even when a person is busy from morning until night. But the moment a clear goal is chosen, something begins to change. The same hours remain, the same 24 hours still belong to everyone. The same world, with its demands and distractions, still exists. Yet the experience of life becomes different because a goal gives structure to thought, discipline to action, and meaning to time. What once felt like random activity begins to feel like movement toward something important. An ordinary day by itself can easily disappear. A person wakes up, handles responsibilities, answers messages, solves small problems, manages interruptions, and arrives at evening wondering where the day went. There may have been effort, but not necessarily progress. There may have been motion, but not necessarily progress. There may have been motion, but not necessarily advancement. This is one of the reasons so many people feel tired without feeling fulfilled. They are expending energy, but not wells, in the service of a clearly defined result. When no goal has been chosen, the day belongs to urgency, to habit, to outside demands, and to whatever happens to shout the loudest. The individual becomes reactive. Life is managed moment by moment, but not guided toward a meaningful destination. A clear goal changes that because it acts like a filter. It helps a person decide what matters and what does not. Instead of saying yes to everything, the person begins to evaluate choices against a larger aim. This creates one of the most valuable forms of personal power, selectivity. Not every invitation deserves attention. Not every distraction deserves response. Not every task deserves equal energy. A goal helps sort the trivial from the significant. It says, in effect, this is the direction I have chosen, and therefore my time, effort, and thought must increasingly serve it. Once that happens, ordinary life begins to organize itself differently. This organization does not require dramatic transformation overnight. In fact, the beauty of a clear goal is that it can turn even modest actions into meaningful progress. A page written each day means one thing when it is merely a habit, and quite another when it is part of completing a book. A daily walk means one thing when it is done aimlessly, and another when it is part of rebuilding health and vitality. Learning a skill for 20 minutes each evening may feel insignificant in isolation, but when linked to a clear purpose, those minutes accumulate into competence, then confidence, then opportunity. The goal gives coherence to the action. It ties small steps to a larger outcome, and that connection changes how the effort feels. There is something deeply satisfying in knowing why you are doing what you are doing. Human beings are not only motivated by activity, they are motivated by significance. They want to know that their labor contributes to something worthwhile. They want their actions to matter. A clear goal provides that sense of meaning. It tells the mind that today is not merely another day to survive, but another chance to move closer to something that has been consciously chosen. Suddenly, ordinary discipline becomes more bearable. Sacrifice becomes easier to accept. Delayed gratification becomes more intelligent. The person can endure inconvenience because the inconvenience serves a purpose. This is why goals are not restrictive in the way some people imagine. Many fear that setting a clear goal will reduce their freedom, as though choosing a direction closes life down. But in truth, the absence of direction is what often creates hidden captivity. A life without goals becomes vulnerable to drift, confusion, and wasted motion. By contrast, a meaningful goal liberates energy. It reduces indecision. It sharpens focus. It frees a person from the exhausting burden of living without a standard. The goal does not imprison the individual. It gives them a path along which their strengths can begin to develop. Goals also change the emotional texture of daily life. When a person is drifting, discouragement can feel heavy because there is no larger context in which to place difficulty. A bad day feels like failure. A delay feels like defeat. A setback feels personal. But when a clear goal exists, challenges are interpreted differently. They become part of the process rather than proof of inadequacy. The individual begins to understand that frustration is not necessarily a signal to stop. It may simply be part of the price of worthwhile progress. The shift in interpretation matters enormously. It allows a person to persist where they once would have quit. Progress itself has a strengthening effect on the human spirit. Even when it is slow, there is an invisible nourishment that comes. As from knowing one is moving in the right direction. A person may still be tired, may still have problems, may still be far from the full realization of the goal. Yet something inside them becomes steadier because they are no longer wandering. They are becoming, they are building, they are participating in their own future, rather than waiting passively for life to improve on its own. This creates momentum, and momentum is one of the most powerful allies a person can have. It is easier to continue moving when movement has already begun. The ordinary day, then, becomes a workshop rather than a waiting room. It is no longer just a block of time to get through. It becomes material from which a life is being shaped. Morning routines matter because they prepare the mind. Work matters because it teaches skill and responsibility. Reading matters because it expands understanding. Rest matters because it restores strength for continued effort. Even failures matter because they teach refinement. Once a goal is clear, the pieces of daily life begin to connect. What once seemed fragmented begins to form a pattern. This does not make every hour exciting, but it makes the day intelligible. It gives reason to effort. There is also an important difference between vague wishes and clear goals. Many people want better lives, but wanting is not enough. A wish is often emotional and indefinite. A goal is chosen, defined, and accepted with seriousness. The mind responds differently to clarity than it does to vague desire. When a goal is specific enough to be imagined and important enough to be valued, the subconscious begins to work with it. Attention sharpens. Opportunities become more visible. Ideas emerge that might have gone unnoticed before. This is not magic. It is the natural result of a directed mind. We tend to notice what relates to what we have decided matters. This is why people with clear goals often appear more fortunate than others. They are not always luckier in any mystical sense. They are simply more prepared to recognize and act upon possibilities that align with their purpose. Because they know what their purpose, because they know what they are after, they can identify useful relationships, valuable knowledge, and strategic opportunities more quickly. The direction is already set, so life's scattered materials can be arranged in service of it. The goal becomes a magnet for ordered effort. Of course, not every goal remains unchanged forever. People grow, insight deepens, seasons of life shift. A goal may refine or expand over time, but even then, having pursued clear aims is better than having lived in permanent uncertainty. Purposeful movement teaches far more than passive waiting. A person discovers their capacities through action, not through endless hesitation. Often the path becomes clearer only after the first steps are taken. Clear goals do not require perfect foresight. They require commitment strong enough to transform today into a meaningful unit of progress. And that is the real gift of a clear goal. It redeems the ordinary. It takes a common day with all its simple duties and repeated efforts and fills it with direction. It tells the individual that this moment counts. This action matters. This discipline is building something. This sacrifice is not empty. The goal transforms life from a sequence of disconnected days into a meaningful journey of becoming, where even the smallest consistent effort can carry a person steadily from routine existence toward genuine progress and a life that feels increasingly intentional, focused, and worth the effort it demands. There is a moment in every meaningful life when everything begins to change, and strangely enough from the outside, that moment may look very small. No crowd gathers, no trumpet sounds, no dramatic sea sign appears in the sky. The person may still be sitting in the same room, holding the same responsibilities, facing the same limitations, and living in the same set of conditions. Yet inwardly, a revolution has begun. That revolution has begun. That revolution starts when a person decides where they are going, not when they merely wish for a better life, not when they admire the success of others, not when they talk endlessly about possibilities. It begins when they make a definite decision, because the moment a person chooses a direction with seriousness, life no longer feels random in quite the same way. It begins to respond differently. Decision is one of the great dividing lines in human experience. Before decision, energy is scattered. Thoughts pull in different directions. Emotions rise and fall without structure. Effort is hesitant because there is no central commitment behind it. A person may feel busy, restless, even ambitious, yet accomplish very little of deep significance because their powers are divided. They are like sunlight spread across a wide field, present everywhere, but not concentrated enough to ignite anything. But once a true decision is made, that same life begins to gather force. The mind has a destination. The will has an object. Attention begins to organize itself. In that sense, the decision itself is creative. It does not merely describe a future, it begins to build one. This is why a serious decision often feels like relief, even when it involves challenge. Uncertainty is exhausting. Drifting consumes enormous emotional strength, because the person is forever hovering between possibilities without committing to one. They keep asking themselves what they should do, what they might become, what path they ought to take. But because nothing has been firmly chosen, the questions repeat without resolution. This creates inner tension. A person can spend months, or us in that condition, feeling vaguely dissatisfied, while never quite understanding why. Often the reason is not lack of ability, but lack of decision. They have not yet told life with clarity, "This is the direction I choose." The moment they do, a remarkable shift occurs. The mind begins looking for alignment. Thoughts once vague now become purposeful. The individual notices opportunities that previously blended into the background. People, books, conversations, and ideas take on new relevance because there is now a standard against which to judge them. The person is no longer simply taking in life at random. They are selecting from it. This is part of the way life responds differently. The world has not changed in a magical sense, but the person engaging with it has changed, and that alters what they see, what they value, and what they act upon. A decision also changes the quality of effort. Before a destination is chosen, work often feels heavy because it lacks connection to something deeply meaningful. A task is only a task, a struggle is only a burden. A sacrifice feels like deprivation. But once a person has decided where they are going, even difficult effort takes on a new character. It becomes an investment. The same early morning, the same long hours, the same repeated discipline can feel entirely different when linked to a chosen purpose. The person can endure more because the effort now belongs to a larger story. They are no longer merely laboring. They are building. This is one of the reasons people often underestimate the power of clarity. They believe progress begins only when circumstances improve, when resources appear, when confidence rises, or when external help arrives. But often progress begins much earlier, at the point of decision. Once a person knows where they are going, they stop wasting so much time bargaining with their own uncertainty. They stop measuring every step against their mood of the day. They stop waiting for perfect conditions. The decision becomes a kind of inner authority. It reminds them why they must continue, especially when the first excitement fades and effort becomes quiet, repeated, and unglamorous. There is another way life responds differently after decision. Other people begin to sense it. Human beings may not always understand the technical details of another person's ambition, but they can often feel the difference between uncertainty and direction. A person who has truly chosen a destination carries themselves differently. Their speech gains conviction, their attention becomes more selective. Their time is no longer offered so freely to distractions. They are not necessarily louder or more impressive, but they are more centered, and this has effects. The right people are more likely to trust them. The right opportunities are more likely to connect with them. The right opportunities are more likely to connect with them, not because the world is unfairly favoring them, but because seriousness attracts seriousness. A drifting person often sends mixed signals. They want progress but avoid commitment. They desire change but resist discipline. They speak of dreams but do not shape their lives around them. As a result, others do not know what to do with them. But the person who has decided becomes easier to help, easier to recognize, easier to respect. Their direction creates coherence, and coherence is powerful. It invites support because it demonstrates responsibility. When a man or woman clearly shows they are moving towards something worthwhile, they often discover that help appears from unexpected places, not all at once, but step by step in proportion to the seriousness of their pursuit. Decision also transforms the way setbacks are interpreted. Before a person chooses a destination, difficulty can feel like proof that they should retreat. Every obstacle becomes a question mark. Every delay becomes a reason to doubt themselves. But after decision, obstacles take on a different meaning. They are no longer signs that the path is impossible. They become part of the path itself. The person begins to ask, not, should I stop, but what must I learn? What must I improve? How do I continue? This is a profound shift, because resilience is born not merely from toughness, but from meaningful direction. When the destination matters enough, the inconvenience of the road loses some of its power to discourage. In a deeper sense, life responds differently, because the person responds differently to life. They begin to act instead of merely react. They begin to act instead of merely react. They become less available to fear, less obedient to passing moods, less dependent on the approval of those who do not share their vision. This does not make them cold or rigid. It makes them grounded. They now possess an internal point of reference. They can say no with more confidence, wait with more patience, and work with more consistency, because they are oriented by something chosen rather than pulled by whatever happens to be urgent. The beauty of this truth is that the decisive moment does not belong only to the young, the privileged, or the already successful. It belongs to anyone willing to make it. A person may have wandered for years. They may have postponed, doubted, hesitated, or drifted. Yet the power of decision remains available. One firm choice can begin to redeem lost time because it changes the use of present time. The past may explain where a person has been, but decision begins to influence where they are going. It interrupts drift. It gathers the mind. It sets the will in motion. And from that point onward, even though the road may still be long, life no longer feels like a shapeless series of days. It begins to show pattern. Effort starts to connect. Meaning deepens. Progress, however modest at first, becomes possible because the individual has stopped asking to be carried and has begun to steer. All of this starts with the decision to choose a destination and accept its demands, because the world tends to open itself, little by little, to the person who has finally made up their mind and committed their life to moving in a definite direction with purpose, courage, and persistence. Anyone can stop drifting, but not by wishing for a different life in some vague and distant way. Drift ends the moment a person becomes honest enough to admit that they have been living too much by habit, too much by reaction, and too little by clear intention. That moment of honesty is more powerful than it first appears. It is the dividing line between unconscious living and conscious living. It is the point where excuses begin to lose their authority and responsibility begins to return. Most people imagine change must start with something dramatic, but in truth, it often begins with a quiet decision. I will no longer allow my days to be shaped entirely by chance. I will choose a direction. I will act on it. I will discipline myself enough to keep going. Purpose is the first answer to drift, because drift exists wherever purpose is absent. A person without purpose may be busy, but their busyness will scatter them. They may be sincere, but sincerity alone cannot direct a life. They may want improvement, but wanting is not enough if it is never translated into a definite aim. Purpose gives the mind something worthy to organize itself around. It answers the question, what am I moving toward? Without that answer, effort leaks away into distractions, delays, and road priorities. With that answer, even a simple life can become deeply meaningful, because every action begins to connect to something chosen. Purpose is not merely a pleasant idea. It is a governing principle. It tells the mind what matters, tells the will where to apply force, and tells the individual why the discomfort of growth is worth enduring. But purpose by itself is not enough. A person can have beautiful intentions and still remain unchanged if those intentions are never carried into daily conduct. This is where discipline enters, and discipline is often misunderstood. Many people think discipline is punishment, rigidity, or joyless effort. In reality, discipline is the bridge between desire and reality. It is the ability to do what should be done even when mood, convenience, or fear suggest otherwise. Without discipline, purpose remains a dream. With discipline, purpose gains structure. The person who says, "I know what I want, and I will order my days accordingly," has already taken a giant step out of drift. Discipline matters because drifting is fed by inconsistency. One day a person feels inspired, and the next day they feel uncertain. One morning they make promises to themselves, and by evening those promises have weakened. They wait for the right emotional state before taking action, and because feelings are unstable, progress becomes unstable too. Discipline breaks this pattern. It teaches a person to act from principle rather than from passing emotion. It says, "My mood does not decide my future. My commitment does." That kind of thinking is liberating because it removes life from the unstable ground of impulse and places it on the firmer ground of chosen behavior. Then there is action, which is where many lives either rise or remain permanently stuck. Ideas have value. Reflection has value. Reflection has value. Planning has value. But at some point, a person must. Drift continues, wherever action is endlessly postponed. The mind can become very skilled at delay while pretending to be thoughtful. It can say, "I am still figuring things out. I need more time. I need more certainty. I need more confidence." But often these phrases hide a deeper fear, the fear of beginning. Beginning matters because action clarifies what thought alone cannot. A person discovers the strength of a purpose, not by imagining it endlessly, but by testing it in practice. Action turns desire into evidence. Action turns desire into evidence. It proves that intention has become reality in motion. What makes this encouraging is that the action required to stop drifting does not need to be enormous on the first day. In fact, the most powerful beginnings are often modest and repeatable. A person chooses a clear aim, they write it down, they decide what one step can be taken today. They take that step whether or not they feel fully ready. Then they take another tomorrow. This may sound simple, but simplicity is often the beginning of profound transformation. Drift is usually built from small, repeated acts of neglect. It is only fitting that purpose should begin through small, repeated acts of direction. One honest decision, one disciplined hour, one completed task, one refusal to postpone again, these things begin altering the structure of a life. The mind changes through this process as well. When a person drifts, they often begin to doubt themselves because they have so little evidence of deliberate progress. Their confidence becomes weak, not necessarily because they lack ability, but because they have not trained themselves to act consistently in the service of a chosen purpose. But when they begin to live with discipline and action, confidence starts to grow in a healthier way. It is no longer built on empty positive thinking. It is built on proof. The person can say, "I am becoming reliable. I am keeping my word to myself. I am moving." That kind of confidence is solid because it is rooted in conduct. There is also a spiritual strength that comes from ending drift. A drifting life often feels fragmented. The person senses that. They are divided within themselves. They want one thing, do another. Believe one thing, tolerate another. This inner contradiction is tiring. But purpose, discipline, and action begin to restore unity. They bring thought, decision, and behavior into alignment. The individual starts living in a way that makes sense to their deeper self. That is one reason purposeful people often seem calmer, even when they are working hard. Their energies are not fighting each other as much. They are gathered. Stopping drift also requires courage, because the crowd will not always understand deliberate living. Most people are comfortable with routine and may even feel threatened by another person's seriousness of purpose. The one who chooses discipline may be told they are changing too much, trying too hard, or Aiming too high, this is where commitment becomes essential. A person cannot stop drifting if they still hand over the steering wheel of their life to the opinions of others. They must decide that their purpose matters more than casual approval. They must become willing to be misunderstood for a time in order to become fully themselves over the long term. The wonderful truth is that this change can begin today, not after perfect conditions arrive. The person does not need to solve their whole future in a single afternoon. They do not need complete certainty. They need willingness. They need enough honesty to admit that drifting has cost too much, enough purpose to choose a direction, enough discipline to govern the day, and enough courage to act before they feel entirely prepared. That is how a life begins to turn, not through fantasy, but through chosen direction made practical. Anyone can stop drifting because the power to choose remains one of the greatest powers a human being possesses. A person may not control every circumstance, every opportunity, or every external event, but they can choose what aim they will serve, what habits they will build, what actions they will build, what actions they will repeat, and what kind of person they will become through daily obedience to that choice. That is where freedom truly begins. And once that freedom is claimed, even imperfect steps start carrying the individual away from passivity and toward a life shaped by intention, strengthened by discipline, and proven by steady action taken one day at a time toward a destination that is no longer vague, postponed, or borrowed from the crowd, but personally chosen and courageously pursued.